Dear brothers and sisters, a common sentiment that we may feel when there is a global climate of unraveling fitna, of trials and tribulation, even technologies that can also be a tribulation that we don't yet know how to get a grasp of, coupled with our own personal struggles and what is generally, an observable decline in human happiness, that people are less equipped than ever to deal with their own personal strife, with their own personal stress, and the overexposure to bad news that is around us. You literally cannot scroll any social media platform or change the channel on any TV or any set except that you're going to see tribulation after tribulation after tribulation. So how do we overcome this sense of paralysis, and how do we overcome this sense of suffocation in the midst of the stress? Number one, الذكر والدعاء. اللهم إني أعوذ بك من الهم والحزن وأعوذ بك من العجز والكسل. SubhanAllah, look at the connection between these things. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from al-ham, anxiety about what is to come, wal-hazan, grief over what has passed, wal-ajzi, to be paralyzed into inaction, wal-kasal, to be lazy, to be struck by laziness. Ham and hazan, if a person dwells too much in anxiety and grief, then they're unable to have the opposite of al-ajz wal-kasal, incapacity and laziness. So you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask Allah azza wa jalla to unlock those things for you. The next thing we learn from our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that where there is confusion, there is always a certain course of action. دَعْ مَا يُرِيبُكْ إِلَى مَا لَا يُرِيبُكْ. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, leave that which causes you doubt and immerse yourself in that which causes you no doubt. Meaning when there's something that's confusing to you, because fitna can become very confusing, and you don't know, you're unable to sort things out properly, you're unable to figure out the best course of action, then exert yourself in a place where you know that your course of action will be blessed. But don't stop exerting yourself. بَادِرُوا بِالْأَعْمَالِ الصَّالِحَةِ. The Prophet ﷺ says, as fitna comes towards you, rush to do good deeds. Rush to do good deeds. And we also learn from our beloved Messenger ﷺ the importance of setting achievable goals in the midst of it all. We're a goal-oriented creation. As human beings, when we don't feel like we are useful, then we find ourselves falling into that sense of worthlessness. And the only way that you can consistently renew your sense of self-worth is to keep on setting goals for yourself, achievable goals, and keep on taking that next step towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when you take one step towards Allah azza wa jal, He comes to you much quicker. And that feeling, just like a dhikr, becomes a lot closer to you and opens up doors for you. So set achievable goals for yourself. The next thing we learn from the Prophet ﷺ is to solve problems that are within our capacity. Man qala halaka an-nas fahuwa ahlakuhum. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever says the people are done is the one who is causing them to be that way. Oh ahlakahum, in one narration, he is the worst of them, the most perished of them. When people look around the world, they talk about them now, they call them keyboard analysts or keyboard warriors. Think before there were keyboards, there are the people that always look at the situation of the world and talk about how terrible it is. And they did absolutely nothing to solve anything of the world. So there is problems in the masjid. Forget about the masjid. Why don't you get involved? Because the masjid is full of this and this and that. Not your masjid, of course. But the masajid are this and this and that. Or why don't you get involved with this? What's the good of this? What's the point of doing this? What's the point of doing that? Because if you do this much, they're doing that much. And so you can't make any real changes. So that person that always is negative and that always finds a hole in a course of action is someone who never does anything for themselves and becomes the most accountable in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because they're deflated on the inside and they deflate everybody else. Solve the problems within your capacity. And that is going to help you, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, unlock something with the barakah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's far greater. Most great people didn't realize that they were great until after they died. This is something that you have an opportunity to do, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, so solve the problems that are within your capacity. We also take from our beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam this idea of making our breaks intentional and counting our breaks as ibadah. Look, we live in a world that tells you have to constantly do. But when you take a step back and you don't, that can be ibadah in and of itself. Your sleep can be ibadah in and of itself. To sometimes take a moment and pause is in and of itself an act of worship. And so sometimes you feel like even when something is happening in the world, if I don't hurry up and weigh in on this WhatsApp group, then everything's going to fall apart. I have to hurry up and act. Be intentional about taking a step back and recalibrating and remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that will allow you to be better equipped to face the problems as they are arising in your midst. The last thing, dear brothers and sisters, is to embrace your challenges as opportunities. This is the beauty. When the Prophet ﷺ says, "Ajaban li amri al-mu'min," how wonderful is the affair of the believer. That everything that happens to him is good. And that's only for the believer. Now I want you to think about this. The Prophet ﷺ taught us about how difficult the last times are. How difficult the end of times are. But he put this opportunity ahead of us, alayhi salatu wassalam. He said that those people that will be with Isa alayhi salam are the best of this ummah, right next to the Sahaba of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. There is an opportunity to rise. Even in the most difficult of times that will strike this earth, there is an opportunity to rise to be amongst the most favorable in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when the Prophet ﷺ mentions the increase in the challenge, he mentions the increase in the opportunity. Inna min waraikum ayyam as-sabr. That behind you, or what comes after you, O companions, are days that require great patience. That patience in those days, كَقَبْضٍ عَلَى الْجَمْرِ, is like holding on to a burning hot coal. But the one who acts in those days has the ajr of 50. Has the reward of 50 people. 50 of them, Ya Rasulullah? No, 50 of you. So as the challenge rises, the opportunity to be pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rises as well. Dear brothers and sisters, when we find ourselves in difficult circumstances and when the global challenges around us become so difficult, when we find our personal stress as well growing, remember to do the good that you know how to do, to speak the truth that you know how to speak, to avoid the falsehood that you know is falsehood, and to avoid acting in confusion and uncertainty. And remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all along, and ground yourself in the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because in the remembrance of Allah we have clarity, and in the remembrance of Allah we have a course of action, and in the remembrance of Allah bi'idhnillahi ta'ala we have a special place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter.